Hello, girls. It's raining out there. I don't know what to do with my umbrella. I guess I'll put it under the sink. I hope I don't forget it.
Welcome to the Little Rock Church of Christ in our Wednesday evening Bible study. We're beginning 2 Corinthians this evening. As we began 1 Corinthians, we introduced that study by looking at the city and where it was, so everybody already knows, right? We might review that just briefly. This is a picture of the area, and Bible students are very familiar with this map. We've got Corinth there where the era is. Cenchrea is the seaport that's mentioned. Athens is not that far away. There's a peninsula in the middle that they have a semi-canal. Became a canal later. It wasn't quite a canal at this point, but they drug the ships through in between. And the area around it is Achaia. That's the brown area that you see in this map. Athens would be included. And he mentions Achaia here in the beginning. It's about 48 miles from Athens, but not that far away. In verse 1, Paul, an apostle of Christ Jesus by the will of God. That, of course, would be emphasized. There were those there at Corinth who were denying Paul's authority, that he would be an apostle. And after all, he didn't live with the other apostles. He wasn't a witness to the life of Christ firsthand. But was he a witness to Christ? Yes, he was. Christ appeared to him on the road to where? Damascus. How far is Damascus? It's up in Syria now. If you're up on the Golan Heights, you look across to the River Jordan, you see most of the land from up there, but if you turn around and look behind you, in the other direction, you can see Damascus on a clear day. One of the things that impresses you that you don't really grasp without being there is the scale. Here's Israel, and Damascus is, we think in Arkansas, here's Texarkana, here's Dallas. We don't think in terms of the shorter distances that this small nation encompasses. The scale is much smaller than most of us imagine. But by God's will, contrary to his own will at the time, God appeared to him. He had chosen him to be his tool. He had seen his heart, and while he had not understood, he certainly did by direct revelation, and was chosen by God's will, not saved at that point. Contrary to Calvinists who think, okay, God appeared to him, zap, At his experience, he saved. But 3 days after that experience, he was still in his sins and told what to do to wash away his sins. That he'd been praying, fasting for 3 days, and was still lost. That's not what saves you. The experience was to make him a witness. Paul is addressing them together with Timothy to the church of God which is at Corinth, with all the saints who are throughout the Cape. So they were part of this group that had the name Church of God on the front, like they have up north, Little Rock. You've seen the Church of God? Is that what he's talking about? No, obviously not. The Church of God originated much, thousands of years after that. But it's called what? Church of God. Well, what is the name of the church? Trick question. Be careful.
The Church of Christ.
Here it's the Church of God. How many times do we have the church called the Church of God? 8 times in the New Testament. How many times do we have it called the Church of Christ? Not really any. Kind of once. It's churches of Christ. Here, Church of God is 8 times. Churches of God another 3 times. It's 11. Compared to 1 churches of Christ and no Church of Christ. So how do we say the name is the Church of Christ?
He said it was my church.
What's that?
He said it was my church.
Well, is it not the Church of God?
Which God are we talking about here?
It's not really a name, it's a
John
job description.
John 1:1 says that Christ is God.
It's also called
The
the
Word
way.
is
Yeah.
God.
We go back to 1 Corinthians, and you see the same phrase, the Church of God. If we look at the way it's referred to in the New Testament, it's the church 61 times. Church of God is 8 times. Churches of God 3. Churches of Christ once, and Church of Christ 0. Now, I don't know how you can say the name is. I don't think there is a name, and I think our contention that there is a name, and that is the name, is, I think it's kind of dumb, just to be blunt. It's not in the Bible as the Church of Christ, and none of these are names. They're descriptions of the church. So where do we get the idea it has a name, and this is the name?
Could be Ephesians 5. Could be Ephesians 5, where it says the husband is head of the wife as Christ is head of the church. And is the wife going to take the name of the husband? If your wife took my last name as Atterbury, you wouldn't be too happy. And so the church is the bride of Christ. So therefore, it's the church of Christ.
We've heard that argument. I've made that argument. But if you look at the practice of the wife taking the husband's name, it's less than 1,000 years old.
Yeah.
If you make that argument in Egypt, they'll look at you like you got 2 heads. They never heard of such a thing. Or in most of the world, they don't do that. And they didn't do it in New Testament times. They began about 1100 in the Anglo-Saxon world. Sorry, that doesn't work.
Well, and I agree. It's just something that popped in my mind.
Yeah.
And my real view is that it doesn't matter if you call it the Church of Christ, the Church of God. It's what goes on inside the church, and what's taught, and whether or not you're following the biblical example.
One thing that's not missing that it comes to my mind is body of Christ. That term is not there. So.
There are a number of different phrases in addition to these. This would sound more like a name, but it's not. None of these are names. The church is 61 times. That's the way it's normally referred to, I would say. And what if we just put the church? It'd be more scriptural.
Well, I have seen signs out front that say a Church of Christ.
What?
A Church of Christ.
Which still kind of implies there's a name.
Right.
What about just saying it's Christ's church?
Christ Church. What we're trying to do, and that the term began to be popular in the days of Alexander Campbell. He was the one that popularized that. And it's interesting that Sidney Rigdon was one that he converted, baptized, taught, and then he bolted and was with Joseph Smith and helped him start the Church of Christ of Latter-day Saints. If you go to Missouri, where the original, the original Reformed Church is, it looks like, it's in the Old English title, Church of Christ. And that came from Alexander Campbell. In those days, he was teaching and communicating pretty effectively that the Lord's Church is not a denomination. It's in contrast to denominations. And this is the body of Christ, the Lord's Church. It's the one that Christ died for. And that term probably communicated that idea fairly well. In my opinion, and this is a matter of judgment, that it does not communicate that today. It does to us. But the people driving down the road that see the sign, that's not what they see. I think we need to think about that. The sign is an opportunity to communicate to the world, and I don't think we're doing it very well. But first we need to learn there is no name. You don't really need a name when there's just one. I mean, like the ark, what's the name of the ark? The moon. Saturn has got dozens, and so you've got to have names. What's the name of our moon? Just one. You don't need a name. And if it's the church, and it's referred to that way 61 times, the idea of the name has, I think, denominationalized the church. It means to distinguish by name. Something to think about. Some of the other phrases that that we see describing, I've got that again, double here, I'm sorry. This is where I'm wanting to go. It's sometimes called churches of the saints, churches Gentiles, churches of Galatia twice. So these are basically locations in the church of the firstborn, Church of God in Christ Jesus. And you see that sometimes with Church of God in Christ Jesus as titles, as names. I think that's all wrong. It never was a name. But when we put our name on the sign, what does that look like? We're just one of them. I think that's what we're communicating to the world. And it ain't the truth. We're what we read about in the New Testament. The Lord's church, the church. I think the sign that said the church would probably communicate better, but then there's some that would make that a tie. It is really, really hard in the context of everybody thinking about denominations to communicate the concept of the New Testament church that we find in the Bible. I've mentioned conversations I've had with Dennis Swift, who's a good friend of mine. He was with the Nazarene Church at the time. We were down in Peru and traveling around. He's an archaeologist. We did research together. Maybe I talked him out of that. We had some pretty loud conversations. But it really, it's just, I mean, he's a really bright fellow, very bright. Insightful, knows the Bible. Boy, I couldn't get that idea across. That just, what do you call it? Just call it the Lord's Church. Well, I haven't seen any with the Lord's Church any signs. Is that what I should call it? You see, he couldn't conceive of the church the Lord died for, just church, like the moon or the ark, the church. It was always in the context of what we normally think of in the United States as denominations. I understand what we're saying, but I don't think the world does. And we're saying to the world some things that I think maybe we need to think about. That's my opinion. Obviously, it's a scriptural concept. But are we saying what we want to be saying? Yes, sir.
Well, I guess was it in the 70s he started using the small c?
That helps.
And then our preacher in California, they changed the name of the city. You know, we were in Los Angeles. They can't all be Los Angeles Church of Christ. And so we used the street name. He said that was unscriptural, but we had the street name. You know, like we called it Rodney Parent Church of Christ. And it just got all crazy, and people just went everywhere.
Well, I'd go a step further. Where is your authority for a name?
It just got, it got crazy.
And we're so used to that. I've had brethren that I've talked to they bend over backwards in order to try to justify. The one referred to the passage there in Galatia, and this is a really bright, knowledgeable gospel preacher. Here is one from whom the whole family of heaven and earth is named. So see, we are named. I said, well, when did you become a universalist? You got the whole family of heaven and earth, everybody that's named. And he kind of backed up and said, well, that's not going to work. But there's this it's the tradition, and we're more tradition bound than we like to acknowledge sometimes. We don't believe in traditions, but you just try to change some of them and look out. Duck. I remember holding a meeting several years ago. The preacher at the church where I was holding the meeting, is one of the most knowledgeable, effective gospel preachers that I know. But he had a bulletin article the Sunday that I got there, and the front page of the bulletin was a lesson on authority. And I think it may be the best bulletin article I've ever seen. It was just brilliant, perfect. The second article was changing the name of the church. And he was judging the motives of those who would even suggest such a thing. They're ashamed of Christ. I said, now wait a minute, right here in one bulletin, I think we may have the best article I've ever seen and maybe the worst article I've ever seen in the same page. You can't change something that doesn't exist. I don't think it's got a name. It's not a name, and how do you change it if it's... In the second place, you got no business judging people's motives. Maybe we're trying to communicate the concept of New Testament Christianity, and this title, like we see here on the sign, is not really doing that. Even if you put the small c, 90% of people are not going to see the small c, and will not grasp the concept anyway. So,
On the real estate appraisals, we had to put house of worship to make it legal.
do we have to? I'll tell you what we did just north of Atlanta. We started a new group, and we were in a converted dwelling. And it would seat maybe 50, 60. But we were starting with several families. And all right, what are we doing? We're going to put something out front. What we decided, Christians worship here. That's not a name. That just communicates, I think. We had 2 to 3 families a week that showed up saying, this is what we're looking for. Just Christians. They got enough sense to know denominationalism's not right. And they see this, okay, here's just Christian. Well, that's what we're trying to communicate, and it was working. Think about that. Yes, sir.
And one other thing, the first time the church is spoken of in the present tense is Acts 2:47, and praising God and having favor with all the people, and the Lord added to the church those who were being saved.
Right. Which one? You don't need to say which one.
And,
the church.
And that was the first time we spoke of the present tense. But one other thought about the name Church of Christ. Over the years, someone asked me where I went to church or what church you're a member of. I'd say Church of Christ. Oh yeah, I know you folks. Something to that.
But you have communicated falsely.
Yeah, so you turn them off right away with their preconceived notions of what you're all about.
I think I mentioned maybe when we went through 1 Corinthians, the story, and I'll just tell it again since we've got some that weren't here, and maybe we need to think about it again. I was in Huntsville, and we were at an Amway meeting. Now, this has been a long time ago, 30 years ago. And after it was over, I was talking to one of the folk there, and, what do you do? Well, I preach. Well, what denomination? I just preach for the Lord's church, the one you read about in the New Testament. Well, what's the name? Well, you've been through that conversation, maybe. And the way I handled it, it was appealing. He understood. And I had a contact. I mean, we were connecting. He said, well, there's no denomination in the New Testament. I understand that. And I don't think what we're seeing today is what we see in the New Testament. I said, well, that's just exactly what we're trying to be, and I refuse to be part of anything else except just what you find in the New Testament. Now, my sister is as sweet and is pretty knowledgeable. Maybe not on this point as much as I would like. She may be watching. She came up and said, oh, he preaches for the Church of Christ. The fellow let out a string of cuss words and turned around and walked out the door. He had been misled, he thought. I was leading him, but I think he was misled by the term. But he felt misled when now that experiences like that bring the point home. We need to communicate the concept of New Testament Christianity, undenominational. And it's hard. And I don't think we're doing a real good job. This is my opinion. So for whatever that's worth, we'll toss that out and let you chew on it a while. But again, you try to change tradition, you better duck. But we don't believe in tradition. Yeah. Any other questions there, comments? In verse 3, he continues, blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies, the God of all comfort. Now that's the phrase that introduces the idea that goes on and on and on here for about 6 verses. Why would Paul be emphasizing who comforts us in all of our affliction? So that who are in any affliction with the comfort with which we ourselves are comforted by God, so also our comfort is abundant. And it continues in 6 and 7 and 8, same way. Just why does he need to talk about comfort to the church of Corinth? Well, it's he's obviously got some purpose, some reason for this super emphasis on the comfort. And I think it's, and he doesn't say, here's my reason, but I think from the context we can get a pretty good idea. He goes on to talk about the fact that he had been under very severe persecution, threats of death that he goes on to describe, near death as a result of, and they were concerned about it. He had actually apparently killed and then revived and then fought with the beast at Ephesus, probably a lion, delivered from that. And these are his brethren, and they're concerned about that. Well, here's the God of all comfort. They're upset, and upset for him, and upset that this may be coming their way. Or at least that seems to be the context. God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our afflictions, so that we'll be able to comfort those who are in any affliction with the comfort with which we ourselves are comforted by God. He is afflicted. They may be and maybe are, and they need comfort, and he says we've got the God of all comfort who can do that. For just as our sufferings of Christ are in abundance, so also our comfort. Our comfort is abundant in Christ. But if we are afflicted, it is for your comfort and salvation. If Paul is afflicted, it's for their comfort. That's a pretty heavy thought, isn't it? Or if we are comforted, it is for your comfort. If we're afflicted, I left out one comfort, didn't I? Another comfort there in verse 6 I didn't highlight. If we're afflicted, it's for your comfort. If we're comforted, it's for your comfort. Either way, God is in control and he will comfort, which is effective in the patient enduring of the same sufferings which we also suffer. You need to endure suffering, and you may have some of the same sufferings. But we also suffer, and you suffer, and we have a God of comfort who provides comfort in those circumstances. And our hope for you is firmly grounded, knowing that as you are partners in our suffering, so also you are in our comfort. We might look at the term comfort that might provide some help. The act of emboldening another in the belief or course of action, encouragement, exhortation, lifting of another's spirits, comfort, consolation. And so here, through several verses, this is what he's talking about. And they are going to be afflicted. He is being afflicted. And all of it triggers God's comfort. Now, he's facing the threat of death, as he'll go on to say. And he's really upset about that, isn't he? No, he's setting the example, the attitude that they ought to have. For we do not want you to be unaware, brothers and sisters, of our affliction which occurred in Asia. I got the wrong, let me fix that, sorry. I got too many twirls there. Just try to ignore that. We do not want you to be unaware, brothers and sisters, of our affliction which occurred in Asia. We are burdened excessively beyond our strength, so that we despaired even of life. Indeed, we had the sentence of death in ourselves, within ourselves. You need to know, he's not covering it up or hiding it from them. This is what happened. That line almost got me. He was faced with it, and they were trying to get it to eat him. And that despaired even of life. He didn't think he was going to make it. We had the sentence of death and fed him to the lions, and he thought that was it. Burdened excessively. I think that would be a pretty good description, wouldn't it? Now, he's not saying you're never going to have this happen to you, but if effectively saying, I was comforted. If you have it happen to you, you will be. You can handle it. I despaired. It was just almost beyond what I could take, but I did. You probably won't face that bad, but whatever it is, you can handle it, is the message. Indeed, we had the sentence of death on ourselves, so that we would not trust in ourselves, but in God who raises the dead. As we pointed out Sunday evening, the power is not in ourselves. It's not self-power or self-confidence. It's God confidence, God power. And so that power, that confidence, that comforts is not us, in spite of us, so that we don't trust in ourselves, we trust in God And if there is death that occurs, this is the God who raises the dead. And so that's the appropriate scriptural attitude. This is God who rescued us from so great the danger of death. That line was right there, and it was there for the purpose of eating him. And he was rescued. And he will rescue us. Now, how did he know that? You know, it wasn't indefinite, but at this point, from that danger, yes, he did. And he's not going to be eaten by lions. He effectively is saying he's going to rescue me from that. He on whom we set our hope. He wasn't rescued from being beheaded, which did come significantly later, probably another 10 years. But he will yet deliver us if you also join in helping us through your prayers. And it's not just his prayers, he needs all the prayers he can get. And you help us. And so they needed to be praying for Paul. But he did rescue, he will yet rescue, deliver. But that's not the final chapter. The final chapter, of course, he was beheaded. May be given many persons our behalf for the favor granted to us through the prayers of many. So you join in helping through your prayers. There is favor granted to us through the prayers of many. We hear the expression, you all pray for me. That's appropriate. And it's not just something you say. It's something you desire for yourself. It's something that you do for others, and hopefully others do for you. Anybody here that thinks they don't need prayers are mistaken. We all do. Paul did, and so do we, and so did the Corinthians. For our proud confidence is this, testimony of our conscience, that holiness and godly sincerity, not in fleshly wisdom, but in the grace of God, we've conducted ourselves in the world, and especially towards you. We got people that just come unglued when they get threatened. As we pointed out Sunday evening, Peter says the key to that guarding your hearts and your minds is what? Keep a clean conscience. And our psychiatrist will spend a great deal of effort trying to work with people who have come apart at the seams, who don't have that confidence. They're not concerned about the conscience. They don't believe in sin. That's not their approach at all. And so they're stumbling over the answer. The proud confidence that Paul had came through the testimony of his conscience. He knew. And notice, when we talk about the testimony of the conscience, what are we normally talking about? You did something wrong. And the conscience will tell us that, and God designed it to do that. That's not what this conscience is testifying to. The conscience testifies in both directions. The testimony of our conscience is that you're holy and godly and you're sincere, and that conscience says that. It will affirm, it will confirm, reassure, give proud confidence, or it will torment, depending on whether or not we're doing what God says. We're taught to honor the conscience. I heard a teacher in a faithful congregation just very recently talk about the conscience as that which tormented and that which just goes haywire and out of control. I don't believe it. Now, there are times when it will say what appears to be ridiculous things. Here's a person who did something trivial and terrible conscience. But if there's a terrible conscience, there's a terrible reason somewhere, and the thing they're pointing to is a smokescreen. Invariably, it's time to look for the big sin if there's big guilt. And a lot of smoke screens. I was telling my wife about an example, the most obvious, almost caricature, but a real situation. The fellow we were counseling with had just really, he was disabled. He had lost his job. He had lost more than one job. His conscience was just driving him up the wall. He was a terrible person. Now, he was a member of the church. He was attending every service. He was leading singing when he could. Well, why do you feel so guilty? Why are you such a terrible person? Well, for example, I went to this dinner on the ground, a church gathering, and I lost my billfold. Now, obviously, if I'd been following the Lord, that wouldn't have happened, and so I obviously am a terrible person. There's two things going on here. First, the conscience is telling him he's a terrible person, and second, he's giving this, which turned out to be very obviously a smokescreen, so that those who he's talking to will say, oh, but that's not important. You're a good person, and that's what he wants to hear. And it works. It took another 2 weeks to find out that he was having a homosexual relationship with the song leader. Now, if you've got big guilt, you've got big, but people really don't want to talk about it, cover it up. Now, you can't accuse people without knowing, and you don't know, but you know where to look. And if you've got big problems, not the conscience has gone crazy. Conscience is to be honored and respected, and I can tell you at least 10 stories like that. Invariably. You see this. In fact, this fellow, he was a bad person because he lost his billfold. Well, that's not what we're talking about, but you do have indications of a big problem because the conscience is saying so. What is, and we would press it. Well, I burp a lot. That's exactly what he said. That was a smokescreen, and he was desperate to find something to divert attention from the real problem. Conscience is to be honored. When it says things are wrong, there's something wrong. Pay attention. Listen, this is from God. It's a message that is to be honored. Here, it was testifying that he was holy and godly and sincere. It will testify to reassure and build up when we're doing what we ought to be doing. It will testify in the opposite direction if we're not. Okay, our time is up this evening. Covered several different subjects. Any other questions or comments anyone got? Okay. We will begin there, Lord willing, at verse 12. Next Wednesday evening.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
If you would, please be getting your song books, and we'll wait till the other classes come in here in a minute. But first song, we'll be singing number 459, 459, Standing on the Promises. As soon as the classes come out.